A quick reminder, every week I write a short reflection on the episodes or things I've been mulling on, and you can find that over at Becoming Antifragile website and click on their newsletter, which is on the top right hand corner to sign up. Let's get into this week's book. It's not so difficult to see that in our particular world, we have a strong desire to accomplish something. Some of us think in terms of great dramatic changes in the structure of our society. Others want at least to build a house, write a book, invent a machine, or win a trophy. And some of us seem to be content when we just do something worthwhile for someone. But practically, all of us think about ourselves in terms of our contribution to life. And when we have become old, much of our feelings of happiness or sadness depend on our evaluation of the past we played in giving shape to our world and its history. As Christians, we even feel a special call to do something good for someone, give advice, comfort, cast out a devil or two, and maybe even preach the good news from place to place. But although the desire to be useful can be a sign of mental and spiritual health in our goal-oriented society, it can also become the source of a paralyzing lack of self-esteem. More often than not, we not only desire to do meaningful things, but we often make the results of our work the very criteria of our self-esteem. And then we not only have successes, we become our successes. When you are in the habit of giving speeches in this country, you find that the older you get, the longer your introducers speak, since they feel obligated to list all your accomplishments from your college days to the present. When we start being too impressed by the results of our work, we slowly come to the erroneous conviction that life is one large scoreboard where someone is listing the points to measure our worth. And before we are fully aware of it, we have sold our soul to the many great givers. That means we are not only in the world, but also of the world. Then we become what the world makes us. We are intelligent because someone gives us a high grade. We are helpful because someone says thanks. We are likable because someone likes us. And we are important because someone considers us indispensable. In short, we are worthwhile because we have successes. And the more we allow our accomplishments, the results of our actions, to become the criteria of our self-esteem, the more we are going to walk on our mental and spiritual toes, never sure if we are able to live up to the expectations which we created by our last successes. In many people's lives, there is a great diabolic chain in which their anxieties grow according to their successes. This dark power has driven many of the greatest artists into self-destruction. In this success-oriented world, our lives become more and more dominated by the superlatives. We brag about the highest tower, the fastest runner, the tallest man, the longest bridge, the best student. In Holland, we brag in reverse. We have the smallest town, the narrowest streets, the tiniest house, and the most uncomfortable shoes. But underneath all our emphasis on successful action, many of us suffer from a deep-seated, low self-esteem and are walking around with the constant fear that someday someone will unmask the illusion and show that we are not as smart, as good, or as lovable as the world was made to believe. Once in a while, someone will confess in an intimate moment, "Everyone thinks I am very quiet and composed, but if they only knew how I really feel." This nagging self-doubt is at the basis of so much depression in the lives of many people who are struggling in our competitive society. Moreover, this corroding fear for the discovery of our weaknesses prevents community and creative sharing. When we have sold our identity to the judges of this world, we are bound to become restless because of a growing need for affirmation and praise. Indeed, we are tempted to become low-hearted because of a constant self-rejection. And we are in serious danger of becoming isolated, since friendship and love are impossible without a mutual vulnerability. And so, when our actions have become more an expression of fear than of inner freedom, we easily become the prisoners of our self-created illusion. That was an excerpt from Out of Solitude by Henri Nouwen. This was my first time reading Nouwen. I hadn't read him before, My wife was reading this book and she had suggested that I have it read a few months ago. And so when I read it, I thought, man, this is incredible. It's full of insights, full of wisdom, and also has so many recurring themes that we've spoken about before. Even just that last section when he says, and so when our actions have become more an expression of fear than of inner freedom, we easily become the prisoners of our self-created illusion. This reminds me of J. Krishnamurti, which is an episode that we've done. And the whole point that Murti is making is that we are all, if we're not careful, coming from a place of fear. And he says fear is the root cause of all the depression, all the competitiveness, all the destruction in this world, all the war, right? It all comes from fear of the other. And Murti's point is, if you just realize that that fear that you have is simply an illusion, that the other person that you are so afraid of, the otherness, the distinction between you, the ego, the selfness, and other people, that is simply an illusion. If you can just realize that fear also that you have will disappear. Before we dive deeper into Out of Solitude, a brief background on Henri Nouwen. Nouwen was a professor of theology at Yale, and then he was also a visiting professor at Notre Dame, and he also taught at Harvard, Divinity. He ultimately left academia and joined the L Arche community, which is a community in Toronto that helps people with disability, and they live in the community with each other. I'm not certain how to say his last name. It's either Nouwen or Nouwen, so you'll hear me going back and forth. By the end of it, I'm sure I'll land on one. But Nouwen was influenced by Rembrandt, Thomas Merton, Van Gogh, and there's a bunch of other people. And Thomas Merton specifically has appeared in multiple occasions in my reading over the past few years. And Thomas Merton was a monk. He was in the same circles, Alan Watts, Aldous Huxley, J. Krishnamurti, all these guys. I do have Merton's autobiography that I'm going to do. And I also have the letters of Vincent van Gogh, which I'm also going to do an episode on. And Out of the Solitude by Henri Nouwen is his meditation on solitude. Why he believes solitude is vital to living a meaningful life and why you should cultivate silence in your life. When I first started reading Out of Solitude, it brought to mind Viktor Frankl's quote from Man's Search for Meaning when he says, "The prisoner's crave to be alone with himself and his thoughts. He yearned for privacy and for solitude." When Viktor Frankl says this particular quote, what has happened at this point is he's been shipped off to collect the dead prisoners and tossed them into basically this pit. And while he's doing that, manages to find this little place behind a shed where he crouches down and is able to be by himself. And while he's in this place, he's essentially practicing a form of visualization that he talks about, right? Where he's seeing himself out of prison, being free, being able to continue his research. But more importantly, it is around this time that he starts to deeply reflect on his love for his wife. And that love for his wife becomes quite strong the more he's able to be by himself, to think and reflect on the beauty of love. As a result of that, he ends up saying in Man's Search for Meaning, "I finally understood what the poets, the philosophers were talking about when they talked about love as this thing that comes from heaven, right? This thing that is beyond time." If you haven't read Man's Search for Meaning, I recommend reading it, or you can listen to the first episode of Becoming Antifragile, which is Frankl's Man's Search for Meaning. Reading Out of Solitude brought to mind another book which has been instrumental in my own journey towards developing and practicing solitude, and that is The Power of Silence Against the Dictatorship of Noise by Robert Cardinal Sarah. And The Power of Silence was a Christmas gift from my wife back in 2017. And I highly recommend reading that book, no matter what your religious traditions are, and no matter whether you identify as religious or not religious. Sarah, in that book, The Power of Silence, is touching a universal principle on why man needs silence and why noise, specifically the distraction of this modern world that we live in, is destroying your mind, is destroying your soul, is destroying your ability to love, your ability to connect with another human being. It's not a typical book. It's more similar to Krishnamurti's book. It's sort of a Q&A type situation, and the answers can go on for pages. And one particular quote that was ringing in my head as I was reading Nouwen's book is Marcus Aurelius in Meditation when he says, "The mind, unconquered by violent passions, is a citadel, for a man has no fortress more impregnable in which to find refuge and remain safe forever. I've mentioned this quote before in other episodes. I am going to do an episode on Marcus Aurelius. I have his meditation. So within this next few months, keep an eye out for meditation. By the way, if you've been enjoying the pod episodes and want to support the podcast, use the links in the description to get the books. It doesn't cost anything more, simply an affiliate link. So I'll add all the books that I've mentioned in the descriptions and you can have a look at them. So now let's get into this book. So Out of Solitude is 3 meditations by Nouwen, right? So, and it's split into 3 parts. The first meditation he calls Out of Solitude, and it lays the foundation for why silence and cultivating solitude is crucial. And then he moves on to With Care, his second meditation. And this meditation is on why caring, comforting, in a genuine way is a core human aspect, and how only through solitude can that care become real instead of it being fake, instead of it being a fickle transaction that you do. Then his last meditation is called In Expectation. Here, Nouwen is suggesting that the hope of the future, remember he's a priest, the hope of the future in theology is just called eschatology. And so Nouwen says, it is in our expectation of joy, the fullness of joy, that you can persist in being able to care and being able to love without burning out. Very interesting point. We'll get into this later on. It's a very small book, right? It's smaller than Tao Te Ching, which is saying something. But like the Tao Te Ching, you should read it slowly. The way I read this is I read through it once and then I reread each section slowly. That's generally what I do with all the other books, right? I'll usually read most of my books at least twice, sometimes thrice, sometimes 4 times. It all depends on the book itself. So now getting into Out of Solitude, right in the beginning, in the introduction, he has this quote, I want to reflect on this lonely place in our lives. So what he's referring to here in this specific quote is this section in the Gospel of Mark where Jesus is traveling around preaching, and then in the middle of all this hustle and bustle, there's this one sentence which reads, in the morning, long before dawn, he, meaning Jesus, got up and left the house and went off to a lonely place and prayed there. And it's that particular sentence that's very influential to Nouwen and how he thinks about solitude. So continuing the quote from Nouwen, I want to reflect on this lonely place in our lives. Somewhere we know that without a lonely place, our lives are in danger. Somewhere we know that without silence, words lose their meaning. That without listening, speaking no longer heals. That without distance, closeness cannot cure. Somewhere we know that without a lonely place, our actions quickly become empty gestures. The careful balance between silence and words, withdrawal and involvement, distance and closeness, solitude and community forms the basis of the Christian life and should therefore be the subject of most of our personal attention. Silence is what allows us to reflect on our lives, on our actions. And so if there is no silence, if you do not cultivate solitude, as Nouwen says, without silence, words lose their meaning. And they lose their meaning precisely because you become a talker. You start focusing on the rhetorics, perfecting your sentences, perfecting the way you speak so that other people look at you differently and start to praise you. Your words, as a result of that, will slowly empty itself of its meaning. And by the end of it, you'll simply have a shell, but inside it's hollow of all meaning and all power and conviction. Similarly, he says, we know that without a lonely place, our actions quickly become empty gestures. There are lots of things that you and I do because we think it's correct, morally right, or because we believe it's some sort of duty to society, to our family, to our friends. And doing it for those reasons are good. There's nothing wrong with it. It's similar to how Confucius thinks about society, right? He's very oriented towards people doing the right thing through this top-down approach. But what I like about Nouwen is this bottom-up approach, bringing that responsibility back to the person, to you and I, to say that you should reflect on your actions. In the lonely place, think about what it is that you're doing. Reflect on it. Understand the reason behind it. Because when you understand it, the action then takes on a whole different meaning. An example I can think of off the top of my head would be giving to charity. There are multiple reasons why people give to charity. for tax reasons. Lots of people give to charity out of obligation or a sense of duty to the religion, to their beliefs, and or you believe that you should give back because you understand that what you have is a result of many things coming together, and it's not simply your hard work that got you there, even though hard work is part of the equation. And in this last sense, you give because you have a deep sense of gratitude. And as a result, your giving is no longer an empty gesture. You're not doing it to look good. You're not doing it so that people look at you and praise you. In one sense, you can still give out a duty, but if you understand why that duty exists, how that is formed, and why you connect with that, again, it's a different sense. And this is why I appreciate the brand and the man, Brunello Cucinelli, precisely for these reasons, right? Because he says to all these corporations who are giving money so that they look good in the eyes of the public, Brunello Cucinelli says, what's important to me is not how much money you're giving away, but how you made that money. And it's more important that you give money to charity as you're growing. And that's what Brunello Cucinelli, the company, has been doing since its early days. It's always been giving back and always had this philosophy around it. I probably will have to do an episode on Brunello Cucinelli sometime in the future, because Cucinelli is a deep lover of philosophy, theology, religion, the way he understands building his company, building his life is different than most other companies and founders out there. So returning back to Nouwen's book, Nouwen says in that section that I read, without listening, speaking no longer heals. Without distance, closeness cannot cure. In that section about speaking no longer healing, so without listening, speaking no longer heals, is correct. And you will have experienced this in your own life if you've gone through a very difficult time in your life, where people have tried to comfort you by speaking, whether they think that the words that they're saying are comforting to you. They're somehow supposed to make you feel better, but ultimately they don't end up listening to you, or not even just listening. When you're suffering, you generally don't want to talk. You just want to sit in silence. A wise friend can come sit beside you and listen to you in silence. Not speaking becomes speaking at those times. Hence, Nouwen says, without listening, speaking no longer heals. I've mentioned the story of Job before, I think in the episode with Epictetus, where Job's friends come when Job is suffering and has lost everything. His 4 friends come, they sit in silence, but then one of them decides to start speaking, and then all of them start speaking. And then at that point, their speaking ends up hurting Job more than their lack of presence before they came to comfort him. So in the excerpt I read, there's a few things I wanted to bring up. The first one is, he says, practically all of us think about ourselves in terms of our contribution to life. And when we have become old, much of our feelings of happiness and sadness depend on our evaluation of the past we played in giving shape to the world and its history. When you're young, you don't really think about how much of a role you've played in terms of your contribution to how much happiness or sadness you have given to this world. When you're young, you think more so in terms of how much can I make? How far can I go? How far can I push myself? It's usually when you're older that you realize the things that are most meaningful in your life that is in stark contradiction oftentimes to the things that you were chasing when you were young. No surprises there for you, because Lao Tzu in Tao Te Ching says, seek Tao when you're young and when you're old, because when you have had Tao, when you find Tao and when Tao is flowing through you, you realize what is enough. You realize that life is not about striving. Life is about living. Life is about stepping into the river and allowing yourself to be fully immersed into the river of life. And that's why King Solomon in Ecclesiastes says, all this striving after women, striving after having the best food, after having the best music, after building the best homes, planting the best trees, having the best fruits, having the best servants, having as many horses as possible. He says, all this is striving after wind, and all is vanity. But what is not vanity for King Solomon is walking in the way of truth. And for King Solomon, it is fear God and keep his command. And the Buddha relinquishes all his wealth, his kingdom, on his journey to become the Buddha. or as is known, when he becomes the Bodhisattva. Whatever it is, the point is, think of your life, your endeavors, the craft that you do, the businesses that you run, in terms of how much happiness or sadness that work is bringing into this world. How much are you shaping it through bringing forth happiness? When you start to orient your thoughts around it, you start to think long term. You start to take actions that would not have any effect next year, might not even have any effect in the next 2 years, but it will have a tremendous impact in 10 years. That's why there's that saying, the best time to plant a tree was 10 years ago. The next best time is now. In that same excerpt, he has this line, more often than not, we not only desire to do meaningful things, but we often make the results of our work the criteria of our self-esteem. And then we not only have successes, we become our successes. The more successful you become, if you're not careful, your success gets tied to your identity. This could be anything. This could be your career. This could be your role as a parent. This could be your role as a friend, as an athlete. Whatever it is, if you're not careful, that sense of success and your achievements gets so tied up with your self-esteem that if something were to happen to that particular thing that is not you, you become quite fragile. And precisely because of that fragility, you start to create a persona around it to protect yourself. Hence why the Buddha in the Dhammapada says, be not attached to this world. Be not attached to the things that you do. Because if you become attached to them, as Nouwen is saying here, where your success is tied to your self-esteem, you will suffer. And for Buddha, the path to enlightenment is to transcend suffering. What holds you back from transcending is your attachment to this world, to this ephemeral world, to this world of mist, as Solomon says in Ecclesiastes. This world is vanity. It's all a vapor. You can't touch it. You can't hold on to it. Nouwen goes on to say, when we start being too impressed by the results of our work, we slowly come to the erroneous conviction that life is one large scoreboard where someone is listing the points to measure our worth. And before we are fully aware of it, we have sold our soul to the many great givers. If you're not careful, you'll start to mistake your life as a list of accomplishments that needs to be checked off, a scoreboard that needs to be compared with another scoreboard. You end up selling your soul to the many great givers, and they become the determiners of your self-esteem. They become the determiners of who you are, when in reality, those great givers only exist because you give them power. Epictetus would say, do not give them power. Do not give your self-worth into the hands of somebody else. Don't let somebody else tell you you're worth it because you somehow helped them. Understand that you don't need anybody else's approval. You don't need anybody else to tell you you're intelligent. Somebody else to like you for you to be likable. And that's why Nouwen says, that means we are not only in the world, but also of the world. Then we become what the world makes us. We are intelligent because someone gives us a high grade. We are helpful because someone says thanks. We are likable because someone likes us. And we are important because someone considers us indispensable. And finally, he ends up saying, when we have sold our identity to the judges of this world, we are bound to become restless because of a growing need for affirmation and praise. Your growing need for affirmation and of praise arises simply because you have given your mind to somebody else. You've given your worth to somebody else to tell you that you're worth it, to tell you that you're valuable, when in reality, you are simply valuable in the fact that you are a human being, in the fact that you are you and you're not somebody else. What Nouwen is saying, what I'm saying, is nothing new. Epictetus has said this, Seneca has said this, Aurelius has said this, Buddha has said this, Confucius says this, Lao Tzu says this, and the list goes on and on. All the sages from all the different eras continually say this because people don't apply it into their lives. People don't take it and reflect on it, mull over it, and come to the true realization where that idea is birthed in you, that seed grows in you. Because you need, no matter the amount of wisdom that you collect, all those wisdom nuggets that you collect, the quotes that you collect, the ideas that you have, they all have to be planted in your soul. They have to be planted in your mind. and they have to grow for themselves. Otherwise, you're simply just collecting a bunch of seeds in a jar, in a glass jar that you can look at and you can pick out here and there. But you want those seeds to be planted in you, grow roots, to go deep into the ground and bring forth fruit, true fruit. You don't want to be the one holding a glass jar with a bunch of seeds of wisdom that you pick out here and there. All this seeking for affirmation and praises from others leads to a sense of disconnect. You start to create an other because you're in competition, because it's all about scoreboards. It's all about how many prizes you can get. And when you do this, the other person, somebody who could be your friend, becomes your enemy. This is why Krishnamurti is so against competition, is so against the idea of competing with another person, because embedded in this idea of competition is a zero-sum game. If I win, you lose. And what ties this idea that Krishnamurti talks about into what Nouwen is saying is this quote from that paragraph. And it reads, "And we are in serious danger of becoming isolated, since friendship and love are impossible without a mutual vulnerability. You can only have vulnerability when the other is no longer an enemy, when the other is no longer competing against you. Because then you can share love, then you can share friendship. Understand, and they understand, that this is not about becoming better than you. This is not about defeating you, but it's about growing together." So in his meditation on our life in solitude, he has this quote, "A life without a lonely place, that is, a life without a quiet center, easily becomes destructive. When we cling to the results of our actions as our only way of self-identification, then we become possessive and defensive and tend to look at our fellow human beings more as an enemy to be kept at a distance than as friends with whom we share the gift of life." Life is to be shared. Confucius has that quote in the Analects where he says, "The wise person is sure to have neighbors." Because life without a neighbor, life without somebody to share it with, to celebrate with, is not a life you want to live. It becomes a life of isolation, and isolation leads to anxiety, leads to depression. And there is a distinction between isolation and solitude. The distinction between isolation and solitude lies more so in the attitude and the approach to why you are cultivating silence. So in isolation and in solitude, you both oftentimes will decide to remove yourself from society, from the community for a time. It could be a long time, it could be a short time. And you use that time to be by yourself, to reflect. But what happens in isolation often is that you don't have a reason to come back, or you don't plan on coming back. Whereas with solitude, oftentimes the goal in solitude is to rejuvenate, to fill your cup back up so that you can return to the community to give them water, metaphorically, to give them water. Whereas in isolation, you go into isolation, whether you purposely remove yourself from the community to live in isolation, you do it all for yourself. You become self-sufficient. And the goal is to be self-sufficient, to not need somebody else, to not have a neighbor. Whereas with solitude, even if you are living a self-sufficient life, it's only for a period of time. And even if you do live a self-sufficient life, right, in the middle of the woods, you understand that what you have is not of your own doing. Put it differently, if you're living in the middle of a forest, you're cutting down your own trees, you're hunting your own food, you have to understand that the food that you eat, the water that you drink, the trees that you cut down, the source of their growth don't come from you. You can raise chickens, but you don't tell the chickens to grow. You can plant trees, but you don't tell the tree to grow. And so the person who goes into solitude understands this and is able to bring this back, this sense of gratitude back to the community. This is the way I understand the distinction. To repeat the quote for Nouwen, "A life without a lonely place, that is, a life without a quiet center, easily becomes destructive." And it becomes destructive because a quiet place, a place of solitude, allows you to reflect. It allows you to bring together all the things that have happened to you, a place where you can be vulnerable in this sense of allowing all the thoughts that you have to flood your mind and to not discriminate your thoughts and giving yourself time for these things to settle down. One way I think about it is if you have a glass jar and it's full of water, and let's say you put in dirt right? And you shake it around. The water becomes very cloudy. It fills all the water and turns brown. But if you allow it to settle down, just as you would do your mind when you're in solitude, when you're meditating, when you're praying, allows you to settle down, all the dirt will settle to the ground, to the bottom of the jar. And from there, you're able to pour water without the impurities there. And in the solitude, in the stillness of the water, you're able to reach in and bring up the dirt. But if you don't cultivate solitude, your life becomes destructive because you're always in action. And there's nothing wrong with action. Becoming antifragile, the reason I called it becoming antifragile is because the way is made by walking in it, and to walk you have to take action. But when I say action in this sense of not cultivating solitude, is when you don't know how to slow down, is when you're afraid of silence because you're afraid of the self that is in you, that you have locked in the corner, shoved away in the corner. You're hiding from some truth about you, from some reality about you that you haven't confronted. It could be your fear of death. It could be your lack of love. It could be so many things. And it's only in the silence of the night, it's only in the silence of the day that you're able to bring this forth. There's this meditative practice, which I personally haven't done before, but it's becoming more popular. And I say popular in a very loose sense. It's not popular with mainstream people, but it's popular within the niche of, hardcore meditators. And it's this idea of going into meditating in the dark, in complete darkness. It could be days on end, it could be a day, it could be 2 days. But what the experience teaches these people, and it's this practice of meditating in silence, meditating in the dark, is the reason why monks have gone into caves for days, for months on end, without ever seeing people. Because in the darkness, you're able to hone your senses, right? Because you cannot see, you cannot focus your eyes on anything. So what ends up happening is your mind now finally can settle down, and your mind, all the things that you've been pushing down, trying to hide, all comes to the surface, and it's in the surface that you're able to call things out. One day I probably want to do this darkness meditation. Nouwen has this quote: "In solitude we discover that our life is not a possession to be defended, but a gift to be shared. It's there we recognize the healing words we speak are not just our own, but are given to us. That the love we can express is part of a greater love, and that the new life we bring forth is not a property to cling to, but a gift to be received." He tells this Tao story about a carpenter and his apprentice, and I quote: "A carpenter and his apprentice were walking together through a large forest, and when they came across a tall, huge, gnarled, old, beautiful oak tree, the carpenter asked his apprentice, 'Do you know why this tree is so tall, so huge, so gnarled, so old, and so beautiful?' The apprentice looked at his master and said, 'No. Why?' 'Well,' the carpenter said, 'because it is useless. If it had been useful, it would have been cut long ago and made it into tables and chairs. But because it is useless, it could grow so tall, so beautiful that you can sit in its shade and relax.' The point of the story is the worth that we often tie to things, to our usefulness, is not the same thing as your usefulness. Otherwise, you would be cut down and made into tables and trees. But it is your uselessness, in quotes, is what allows you to grow. It is what allowed this tree to grow so tall and so huge that it ultimately ended up giving shade where people could sit under, take a break from their long journey." And Nouwen goes on to say, "In solitude we can grow old freely without being preoccupied with our usefulness. And we can offer a service which we had not planned on. To the degree that we have lost our dependencies on this world, whatever world means, father or mother, children, career, success, or rewards, we can form a community of faith in which there is little to defend but much to share." The other thing about solitude is that it forces you to live in the present moment. And that's also why I would like to do this darkness meditation sometime. Because in solitude, you have to be fully present here and now, because you're not doing anything else. Your mind might be wandering, you might be wanting to think about other things, but your time then in silence is to bring all your thoughts back and for them to settle down. To use that jar and water metaphor, right? Your goal is to keep that jar from shaking and from jerking around so that the water can be still and so that the mud and dirt can settle to the ground. And this is why Nouwen says, when you are able to create a lonely place in the middle of your actions and your concerns, your successes and failures slowly can lose some of their power over you. For then your love for this world can merge with a compassionate understanding of its illusions. Then your serious engagement can merge with an unmasking smile. Then your concern for others can be motivated more by their needs than yours. In short, then you can care. Let us therefore live our lives to the fullest, but let us not forget to once in a while get up long before dawn to leave the house and go to a lonely place. I will do an episode on Jesus sometime in the future. What has always stood out to me about Jesus and his ministry is the point that Nouwen picks up, that aspect that Nouwen picks up, which is Jesus always wakes up early in the morning and he goes to a lonely place. But usually he doesn't only just go to a lonely place. He goes and climbs a mountain, a hill, and he goes up on top and he does his prayers there. I have this picture of Jesus climbing up a mountain, going to the top where there's this one tree and he just sits under that tree. And this picture has been in my mind for a very, very long time. And the older I've gotten, the more I understand and realize why Jesus, through all the hustle and bustle, he always found time to be alone. And that's because in the silence, in the solitude, in the loneliness, that is where he was able to cull the noise, cull the distraction, focus his mind, revitalize his soul. And that's precisely the lesson that Nouwen, Out of Solitude, is trying to teach us here. Now, moving to his meditation on care, Nouwen says, real care is not ambiguous. Real care excludes indifference and is the opposite of apathy. The word care finds its roots in the Gothic kara, which means lament. The basic meaning of care is to grieve, to experience sorrow, to cry out with. I am very much struck by this background of the word care because we tend to look at caring as an attitude of the strong toward the weak, of the powerful towards the powerless, of the haves towards the have-nots. And in fact, we feel quite uncomfortable with an invitation to enter into someone's pain before doing something about it. Beautifully said there. And the reason we feel uncomfortable on the last point is precisely because we live in a society of usefulness. You have to be useful, or you always have to be doing something that's of value to your shareholders, to your customers, to your family, whatever it is. But cultivating silence and solitude in a very real sense is the opposite of usefulness, as the Tao story of the carpenter and his apprentice revealed. But even though it is useless in the sense of having utility in our daily exchange of capital and commodities, what solitude teaches us instead is that you are not different from the other. You and the other are not two separate beings in this world who are unconnected, unrelated. You and the other, you and your neighbor, that's your brother, that's your sister. And that's precisely why when Jesus is asked by the leaders, what is the greatest commandment? And he says, the first is love the Lord your God, and the second is love your neighbor as yourself. And that's a very high bar that Jesus is raising there, right? To love somebody else the same level as you love yourself. And there's a quote from Ender's Game, the book that I've mentioned before, and it goes, in the moment when I truly understand my enemy, understand him well enough to defeat him, then in that very moment I also love him. I think it is impossible to really understand somebody, what they want, what they believe, and not love them the way they love themselves. When you understand somebody fully, you love them as they love themselves because you see why they do the things that they do. You see why they think the way they think. And then you realize that you are no different than they are. And it is this realization that allows you to care deeply and care in a way that is not a transaction, as if you're not trying to get something, as if you're not ticking off a box on your to-do list. And so I quote Nouwen, still, when we honestly ask ourselves which person in our lives mean the most to us, we often find that it is those who, instead of giving much advice, solutions, or cures, have chosen rather to share our pain and touch our wounds with a gentle and tender hand. The friend who can be silent with us in a moment of despair or confusion, who can stay with us in an hour of grief and bereavement, who can tolerate not knowing, not curing, about healing, and face with us the reality of our powerlessness. That is the friend who cares. That section is a triple highlight for me. If you want to be a good friend to somebody, learn to sit in silence. If they're suffering, learn to sit there and not provide words of comfort because you think that's going to help them. Learn to be there. When your friend is confused about what's happening to their life, if they're going through something difficult, learn to just sit there and listen. Do not try to fix something. A good friend has the ability to live in the ambiguous, in the ambiguity of life. And our whole life is this, right? Nobody knows the future. Nobody understands what's going to happen. Nobody knows why you're suffering right now and not yesterday or not tomorrow. But a good friend will be able to sit with you in the ambiguity. And they're not afraid of it. They're not afraid of the thoughts that you're having. They're not afraid to be in the presence of pain. They're not afraid to be in the presence of confusion. If you have a friend like this, that is when you know you have a good friend. You know precisely what I'm talking about if you have gone through something difficult, if you've gone through something monumental. There are friends who'll try to comfort you, speak gibberish, quote verses that they think will be helpful. Even if it's true, if you speak truth without love, you might as well be a clanging cymbal without an orchestra. And there are people in your lives who are so caught up in thinking the right thing, in saying the right words, that when you say something that's not right in their eyes, they always try to correct you. Those are not friends, right? They are friends in one sense or the other, but they're not good friends. They're not people who have developed an understanding of what life is about. They haven't realized that life is not a riddle to be solved, but a river to swim in. And you want people who can step into the river with you, not somebody who's nagging, telling you that you're doing this wrong. You should be believing this. You should be thinking this. You're going through a difficult time and here's a solution for you. And in the midst of suffering, a good friend is willing to stand beside you. And I quote Nouwen, "Are we willing to not run away from the pain, to not get busy when there is nothing to do and instead stand rather in the face of death together with those who grieve?" You also have to ask yourself, are you a good friend to others? You might have good friends in your life, but are you a good friend? Or are you somebody who can exist in this ambiguity? And if you're not, this is a call to do precisely that. And he goes on to say, the friend who cares makes it clear that whatever happens in the external world, being present to each other is what really matters. In fact, it matters more than pain, illness, and even death. It is remarkable how much consolation and hope we can receive from authors who, while offering no answer to life's questions, have the courage to articulate the situation of their lives in all honesty and directness. Kierkegaard, Sartre, Camus, Hamish Marks Joel, and Merton, none of them have ever offered solutions. Yet many of us who have read their works and found new strength to pursue our own search. The point that Nouwen is making is that to care means to be present with the other, to be in the moment with them. That is what care is. Care is not about trying to fix somebody. Care is preceded by your silence, because in your silence you are caring for yourself. And you have to cultivate that care for yourself to be able to then offer it to somebody. And sometimes the best care is silence, and silence is what you've cultivated. And there's a good quote near the end when he says, "But cure without care makes us into rulers, controllers, manipulators, and prevents a real community from taking shape. Cure without care makes us preoccupied with quick changes, impatient and unwilling to share each other's burden. And so cure can often become offending instead of liberating." If you're not careful, you can hijack something like cure and care that's supposed to be good and use that to manipulate people, to rule over them. This prevents you from creating a real community, where if you're in a real community, the otherness of your friend fades away, and it's not about whether you're better than them, whether they're worse off than you. And then there's this other quote, which I really like, and he says, "Those who are not afraid to hold a hand in gratitude, to shed tears in grief, and to let a high sigh of distress arise straight from the heart can break through paralyzing boundaries and witness the birth of a new fellowship, the fellowship of the broken." When you genuinely care for your friend, that shows in the way you treat them. Your words and you speaking can often be a barrier. And what's better in these moments are action with love, and that is care. Nouwen tells a particular version of a very famous story. And this version is about a professor and a Zen master. And I quote, "There is a story about a university professor who came to a Zen master to ask him about Zen. Nanin, the Zen master, served him tea. He poured the visitor's cup full and then kept pouring. The professor watched the overflowing until he could no longer restrain himself. 'It is overfull. No more will go in.' 'Like this cup,' Nanin said, 'you are full of your own opinions and speculations. How can I teach you Zen unless you first empty your cup?' And often in the silence is where you empty your cup. But sometimes it is in the silence, in the solitude, that you carve a larger cup from the wood. You create a larger jar to which you can fill it with water." And so Nouwen says, to care means first of all to empty our own cup and to allow the other to come close to us. It means to take away the many barriers which prevent us from entering into communion with the other. Then from care, he brings this reality that caring for other people, even with the solitude, you can burn out. You can end up essentially going through the motions. And he says the way to prevent this, because he's a Christian, is the eschatology, right? Is the coming time when there is eternal joy. So he writes, "Our life is a short time in expectation, a time in which sadness and joy kiss each other at every moment. There is a quality of sadness that pervades all the moments of our life. It seems that there is no such thing as clear-cut pure joy, but that even in the most happy moments of our existence, we sense a tinge of sadness." So he says this eschatology, right, this expectation of the future, you can see it as patience, where you are preparing yourself patiently for the coming joy. So he writes, "That is the great conversion in our life, to recognize and believe that the many unexpected events are not just disturbing interruptions of our projects, but the way in which God molds our hearts and prepares us for his return." So Nouwen is seeing this time that we're here on earth as a way to cultivate patience. This expectation, you're excited for coming future, but you're also living in this present moment, right? You're tied to here and now and also into what's to come. Nouwen says it's like when you receive a letter in the mail and the letter says that, a friend of yours, a lover of yours is going to come see you in the next week, next 2 weeks. And that time between receiving the letter and when your friend appears, at that time, he's saying, this is the time that we're living in. It's that expectation of patience, as he calls it. But in this, there's a quote that resonates with me. And it goes, "Our great temptations are boredom and bitterness." And for Nouwen, bitterness is there precisely because it's not happening fast enough. Your friend is not coming fast enough to visit you. But what I liked is, our greatest temptations are boredom and bitterness. To me, boredom is not a temptation. We actually seem to have found a way to remove boredom from our lives. And in the solitude, in this practice, right, when you go away and you sit in silence, when you meditate early in the morning, late at night, when nobody's around, you'll notice that you get bored. And that's why your mind wanders. But you need to allow that to happen. You need to allow your mind to just settle still and let all the thoughts go in and out. Because it is in the boredom that you learn how to care for others. It is in the boredom that you realize that there is no other. It is you. Your neighbor is yourself. And for that reason, I wouldn't put boredom as a temptation. But Nouwen goes on to say about the expectation, right? He says, "The paradox of expectation indeed is that those who believe in tomorrow can better live today, that those who expect joy to come out of sadness can discover the beginnings of a new life in the center of the old, that those who look forward to the returning Lord can discover him already in their midst." And because he's Christian, when he says Lord, he's referring to Jesus specifically. What stood out to me from that quote was the last sentence when he says that those who look forward to the returning Lord can discover him already in their midst. Because what Nouwen is saying is God is not in the future. God is here in the present moment, right now, right here. And I think what he's trying to do is preemptively address somebody who says, well, Nouwen, if you're all about the future and hoping for a better future, then you don't live in the present. But Nouwen's trying to get to the idea that no, you can still hope for the future. That is the paradox of life. But because you hope for the future, you actually live in the present even more deeply. And I want to wrap with this last quote when he says, as long as we are occupied and preoccupied with our desire to do good, but are not able to feel the crying need of those who suffer, our help remains hanging somewhere between our minds and our hands and does not descend into the heart where we can care. But in solitude, our heart can slowly take off its many protective devices and can grow so wide and deep that nothing human is strange to it. And the challenge is to find solitude in your life, to live in the moment, to live in this now. And in the solitude, allow your mind to settle down, empty the cup, then return to the community and care in a way that's meaningful. And with that, thanks for listening to this episode. If you're not already subscribed, do subscribe and share this episode with a friend if you found it valuable. If you haven't already, leave a review on Apple or Spotify or wherever else you listen to. Until next week, peace.